Is there a reason there's not more AD carries with Varus's attack range of 575? One of the things about attack ranges is that for most players, you only get advantages when you're a 50 range difference, which means in the case of a character like Varus's attack range, when you consider the average range in League is 550, 575 doesn't tend to give you much of an advantage of over 550 characters, whereas 600 does. And so if you're wondering, like, why wouldn't we put a character at 575, it doesn't mean we couldn't do it. But a lot of times it's like, well, if you want someone to be long ranged, they probably need to go to 600 before they can start taking advantage of that range. A way I would describe 575 is like it's a versatile attack range in the sense that a 575 character will have an advantage over 525s, not be at a disadvantage versus 550s, and not be at a disadvantage versus 600s. Which is one of the reasons Varus tends to be so versatile in pro play, is he's kind of just good versus everyone. Like, he's not like gonna be broken versus everyone, but he's not gonna be bad versus anyone except Caitlyn. Caitlyn's like the one person who can really get a leg up on him. And then, Jinx once her rocket range gets online. Or Aphelios, I think, with the sniper gun. But it's like kind of the thing where it's just like 575 doesn't say, oh, I have a crazy range advantage versus 550s. But it does say, I don't have a crazy range disadvantage versus 600s. Right? So it's kind of like puts you in the middle and says, like, I'm kind of just decent. But a lot of times, though, of course, like I mentioned, if we want someone to be really good at range, then we don't say, oh, we want you to be kind of good at decent. We say, like, okay, let's give you a range advantage. And we go to 600 for characters like Ashe and Senna. Do you think putting more 575 chance would make people learn the 25 difference better? No, the 25 difference isn't learnable. That's the thing. It's actually just based on how League of Legends works at its core as a game. 25 range is, in terms of range auto-attacking advantages, is very, very negligible and even somewhat inconsistent to some degree. And so it's not like I can learn this 25 range advantage and like really, really, really take advantage of it. It's like the actual gameplay of kiting people as 550 versus 575 like doesn't express itself all that option in terms of difference. You need 50 to really get that difference most of the time. What's the philosophy behind a mana or manaless resourceless champ? Why haven't there been an energy champ between Ambessa and Zed? Mana, different characters have like different needs. Generally, like the default is generally supposed to be mana in League of Legends, and the main function of mana in modern League of Legends is to give you lane attrition. It's to say, if you spam your spells on cooldown in lane, you will eventually run out of spells to spam and have to go back. And what that buys a champion, if they have mana costs, basically, is it gives them some combination of the ability to have lower cooldowns on their spells, easier to hit spells, more unfair spells, and higher damage spells, higher output spells. Whereas if a character like, say, Jarvan didn't have mana, let's assume Jarvan could still lane, but like a character like, say, Jarvan didn't have mana, his Q, if he was a laner, would have to likely be some combination of higher cooldown or lower damage or things like that. And so that's the general idea of mana. Is an attritional thing, and it's especially good for gating characters that like don't need to put their health bars at risk to interact with you. So as an example, AD carries are like one of the prime examples here. AD carries have ranged basic attacks that are free, right? And so there's a lot of matchups where an AD carry, like if they didn't have mana cost, could just spam you with Caitlyn Qs and auto attacks until you have to leave, right? And so mana cost is a way to attrition Caitlyn out of lane that's not taxing her health bar necessarily. For a number of melee champions, they don't need mana cost to have compelling and okay lane patterns, because the thing they're paying in lane when they try to interact with you is their health bar. For a lot of melee champions to approach a wave, they have to pay in some of their health bar. For a lot of melee champions to try to engage on you, they have to pay some of their health bar. And so a number of melee champions can get away without having mana, because they're putting a different thing at risk, which is, you know, their attrition, their health bar. And then on top of that, there's some patterns that just don't make a lot of sense with mana. And so because of that, we don't give them mana, and instead we like either give them other weaknesses or tune their cooldowns. Like, as an example, Yasuo's pattern makes a lot less sense if like it's bad to E a bunch of things, right? Like if Yasuo's E and Q had mana cost, that character would make so much less sense as a laner, because you'd be like, well, I want to like E the wave a bunch and Q the wave a bunch to like play the game with that my kit intends, but I can't because then I'll run out of mana. And so instead, Yasuo has things like a really, really, really high cooldown on his W. And he has things like his Q earlier on in the game doesn't do a ton of damage. And his E, you know, his E also in the grand scheme of things doesn't do a ton of damage. And, you know, has to be targeted and things like that. Someone mentioned Aurelia here. Aurelia sustains a lot. That's makes it harder for her to have no resource costs, things like that. Yeah, and so that's the thing. And then other characters, like, it's like not even about play pattern in terms of like what would make a compelling lane pattern, but they just wouldn't work with mana. So two of the characters that I made that I wanted to give mana and I decided not to were Viego and Briar. Viego can't have mana because of his transformation. Basically tracking mana states between transforms was too much. And so it felt pretty important that I remove mana from Viego, just so that you're not constantly like, okay, and after I get out of here, how much mana do I have, etc., etc., etc. It didn't make a lot of sense, given he's turning into other characters all the time. And in exchange, like, you know, Viego, at the end of the day, his Q probably doesn't do as much damage as it could, things like that. Especially if he's a laner. It's also a note in terms of mana that it's a lot less important that junglers have mana, because we basically tuned the jungle items to give junglers most of the mana they'll ever need, unless their name is like Karthus or something. Briar as a character, I also tried to give mana, and the problem with giving Briar mana was that she would just kill herself. If Kai'Sa runs out of mana, Kai'Sa can just run away. She can be like, oops, I'm out of mana, I guess I'll leave. If Briar runs out of mana mid-frenzy, she just instants the enemy team and dies. And so I was getting to the point where it's like I couldn't give her E a mana cost because she needed it, and I couldn't give her Q a mana cost because she needed it during Frenzy. And at that point, it was just like, if her only spell on her kit is W, why would Briar have mana cost? And so I moved her to health cost, and Briar is a lot more about just like how she manages her health as a resource and her spell cooldowns, things like that. Also, she's overwhelmingly a jungler, which again means that mana is less of a burden or constraint there.